Welcome back to another reading and correcting with me, Kindar, the Tiger Knights, and Ty, the Tiger Supervisor. These are where I read a chapter from one of my books and correct it as I go. If you want to listen to these live, it's every Tuesday morning, 8 a.m. Eastern Time on Twitch. And if you are looking to support me, that is on my Patreon. Today we are doing chapter 35 of Breaking Step. Do, Alistair said, is the Arcanus representing purity. The shape he formed over his hand didn't look like purity to Tibs. It was a mix of curves and lines, as if it couldn't decide which she preferred. Purity would know. Purity wouldn't settle for doing it part way. She wouldn't have. She wouldn't have. She wouldn't have she'd wouldn't have she wouldn't have she wouldn't have anything until she'd worked the prop wow she wouldn't have anything until she'd worked the problem and had a solution. She wouldn't have anything, okay, like she wouldn't have an arcanus until she'd worked the problem and had a solution. Okay, it still feels clunky, but it works. Tibs recreated it. Making the Arcanus like this, using his assets, was simple. A shaping of water in the into the form. It was adding them to the etching alone, or as part of a filigree, where the complication came. The placement needed to be exact for the effect he wanted it to add. The more of the Arcanus, the harder it became. If he used more than one Arcanus, the difficulty increased again. Smaller errors caused ever-growing differences to the expected result. When used alone, his teacher continued, do adds sharpness to an attack. Shouldn't that be metal? Tibbs asked. Or crystal? The fragile crystals broke when when fragile crystals broke into shards, they could slice skin open. Purity should be, he trailed off, realizing he might reveal too much of what he knew of her personality. I don't know, removing impurities or something? That made no sense. The Arcanus weren't the elements they were associated with, but as a kid, he was a kid, so Alistair would. You know better than that, Tibs, Alistair said in a reproachful tone, and I can tell you aren't paying attention. What's distracting you? Nothing. He just wanted this to be straightforward. None of this confusing arcanas that were linked to an element that had nothing to do with its effect, or his supposed friends intent on getting getting in his way instead of supporting him. Alistair studied him. Then, if you don't mind, let's continue with the lesson you insisted on getting. Etch a line, place due at 3, 7, and 9. Once done, send it at the target. The etching his teacher did with a knife was complex. So many of the arcanist tips couldn't follow them as they formed, as if the knife's point wasn't actually tracing them, but just laying the lines where they went. Another show of us teacher knew etching didn't need a point to be traced, or was it part of? Really? Or was it part of something he would teach later, again believing it was the right way to do it? There was no light on the words when Alistair explained the need for the knife point, so at least so he at least believed it was needed in some fashion. On the other side of the training room, water formed into a pedestal, then a torso, that of a woman, as the water flowed and gave her chest curves, then the neck and a distinctive face. Tips raised an eyebrow. I thought you might want to let some of your anger out. I'm not angry at her. She was only the agent of the guild, doing what she was ordered to. He formed a knife and showed Alistair it had no jagged edge to it. He quickly formed the etching as instructed, lines and spirals with the filigree, and sent it at Tirania as a representation. The water splashed over her face without visible effect. Stepping closer, he saw fine scratches in the hard water. That wasn't particularly impressive. Not bad for a first try, Alistair said, but you misplaced dew. Tibs frowned. He was confident he'd placed them where instructed. How much more damage would it have done if I had placed it correctly? More than this, but dew by itself isn't the deciding factor. Alistair walked back to where they'd been, and Tibs followed him. How many lines you add to your etching will act to increase the damage. The spirals and how well they intersect with the lines will pull more essence, which will also blah. How many lines you add to your etching will act to increase the damage. The spirals and how well they intersect with the lines will also pull more essence, which also increases the damage. He faced the water bust. You shouldn't worry about that at the moment. This isn't about. How do I keep flipping the bleeping words? This isn't about causing damage, but having you get a sense for how to properly divide each section of the etching. But Alistair smiled as he quickly traced the same etching Tibs had. Even dew were in the same position he'd put them, as far as he could tell. But when the water splashed on Tirania's face, blades of water sprang forth, and when the etching faded back into essence, she was gone. Properly etched, even one as simple as this can yield deadly results. And use up far too much essence, which made it harder to control. Tibbs wasn't looking for something that would obliterate everything it splashed on. He wanted something precise that wouldn't leave evidence of what he'd done behind. Or, if it did, that the evidence wouldn't lead back to him. He's not going to do it, Kenny snapped angrily as Tibbs and his teams walked up to the stairs. He said he wouldn't, Stowe replied resignedly. Good. That meant he wouldn't do something stupid when his friends insisted Tibbs do what they told him. He helped you, Tibbs, she snapped. The least you could do is show some gratitude. Leave it, Genny. She let out a huff, then silence. It lasted until they reached the doorway. Here? Don asked. No, Jekyll replied. It's too close to the entrance. We don't want the guards to see him losing it. Once we're on the third floor, we'll have all the privacy we need. Don opened the doorway, and once they were before the tiled hallway, Jekyll faced Tibbs. All right, Tibbs. Time to let go of water. No. Tibbs, you promised, Mess stated. He snorted. If you believe me, that's your problem. We have a run to do. Tibbs walked past his team, sending water essence ahead to make sure Genny hadn't changed the triggers to the crest rooms. Stay here, Jekyll ordered. Me and Mr. Lightfingers are going to have a talk. I question the wisdom of your plan, Comdar said. Okay, I know all of these were added to the dictionary. Did you reset everything without telling me? Pro writing aid. If anyone who knows me, the fighter replies, which includes you, knows wisdom's never been one of my defining traits. Jekyll reached Tibbs at the junction, stepping where he had, so he wasn't changing which corridor would be open. That was good. Tibbs had expected Jekyll to try that as a way of forcing him to obey. Tibbs stepped to the right, following the trigger, which opened the way to the lion crest. You aren't talking me into letting go of water. Jekyll's reply was a non-committal grunt, and Tibbs narrowed his sense to push through the miasma to keep track of the fighter. He didn't know what his plan was, but he'd be ready for it. Tibbs stepped on the next trigger and tensed as Jekyll put a hand on his shoulder. This is far enough. Tibbs let out a put-upon sigh and turned. Jekyll, as your friend, I'm telling you to stop pushing. Tibbs, as your friend, and if you weren't so full of it right now, you'd know I can't stop pushing. I'm warning you, Jekyll. You aren't going to like what I do to make you stop. Jackal, Don called, maybe you shouldn't be doing this on your own. How about we make sure this remains private? The fighter said with a grin. A wall of stone slammed down behind and ahead, forming a large room with only Tibs and Jackal in it. Tibs stared at them, then Jackal, trying to understand how he'd done it. No essence had flowed out of the fighter, and they were both standing still, so he couldn't have stepped on a trigger. Not that any of the triggers had caused that result before. Ganyan made this floor, so all they had to do was rearrange the passages. He glared at the fighter. You did plan this with Stowe. Jackal smirked. What? I'm always talking to it. Sure, I can't hear what it says, but I know it can hear. I know it hears me. And considering you heard its cry of help for help all the way into town, I figured it could hear me if I stood by the stairs. Not to make sure no one was around, but not a lot of people get up in the middle of the night to gaze at the dungeon. You can't do this, Tibs told the ceiling. We're in the room. Actually, Kenny replied, sounding smug, we can. Or did you forget its distance? Not your presence that limits what Stowe can do? Scared to speak for yourself, Stowe? That you think that, Jekyll? That you think that, Tibbs, Jekyll said, shows how bad what you're doing is for you. I'm asking you, as your friend and brother, let it go before this turns bad. Tibbs declared to the fighter. It's too late for that. The sword formed in his hand as he swung. The blade elongated in anticipation of Jackal stepping back. Instead, the fighter jumped back, the leap taking him nearly to the wall. A stone ending in a point formed in Jackal's hand, and Tibbs made his shield. Instead of throwing it, the fighter moved it before him, essence trailing in its wake. Tibbs stared as Jackal etched, and included Arcanus within it. Ka, Fe, Bor, and two others he didn't know the names of. It wasn't simply that Jackal could etch. He was Lambda, so he would have received the basics by now. It was how precise the etching was, spirals within waving lines and straight ones, but going up and down instead of pointing at Tibbs. Tibbs had never thought of Jackal as someone who even knew what precision was. What? The fighter said, sounding offended. Did you think us Lambda fighters weren't taught etching? Or that you're the only one who can talk his instructor into pushing beyond what he's supposed to teach? What did the etching do? It caused the air to shimmer with earth a pace before Jackal and for close to a pace in thickness. But there had to be more. Alistair hadn't mentioned waving lines at this point, or that the lines directing the essence didn't have to point forward. And the filigree? Tibbs was still working with single Arcanus. He had no idea how 5 of them could change what he saw, even if he'd known the base effect. Do you think this is going to protect you? I think it's going to give us time to talk, Jekyll replied. There's nothing you can say that's going to change my mind. He made his etching, not bothering with tracing it. He'd used the one his previous day's training, making sure Do was in the correct position. It probably wouldn't kill Jackal, but all he was interested in was at the moment was to impress on him he was outmatched. The water flew at the fighter, hit the shimmering wall, and scattered. As it moved through it, the shimmering points sent the essence in all directions, to be caught by the waves and pushed further away. As hard as Tibbs tried to force it to maintain the form of the attack, his will didn't seem to make it into the etching. You're hurting Cragglerock, Tibbs. I'm doing what I have to so the guild never hurts anyone here again. The way you're going, there's not going to be anything left of the town for the guild to hurt. And anyone strong enough will survive, Tibbs stated. But you aren't going to be one of them. This time, the etching was 9 lines intersecting at the point with 6 spirals around them and a filigree of Fey. But he didn't simply count on it pulling essence as it reached the fighter. He added from his reserve. The attack impacted the shimmering wall faster and harder, moving deeper before it started scattering. But instead of being sent all around and dispersing, the filigree caused the thick essence to cling within Jackal's etching. Tibbs sent another one. If he couldn't have an attack make it through the wall, he'd overwhelmed the fighter's defense. That's how you now solve your problem? By killing? What are you going to tell Crow, Tibbs? That the dungeon did it? You're always throwing yourself at the creatures in here. It's not going to be hard to convince him you finally went up against one that was too strong for you. You're going to break his heart, Tibbs. Jekyll replied sadly. Then don't force me to do this, Tibbs snarled and filled the cracks. He pointed the way they'd come. Leave! Take the others with you. I'll make myself another team, another family, one that understands me, that supports me. One that's okay with you becoming worse than my father? I'm never going to be like him, he replied with a snort. Tibbs, Jekyll replied quietly, what would Karina think of what you're doing? Don't mention her. The crack was so sudden he thought his ears rang from the imagined noise. He'd rushed through it, and he hurried to fill it before it became too much. Why not? All this is because of her, isn't it? Because the guild didn't act to stop my father, and he killed her before you. It was their job to make the town safe. Tib growled, spiderwebs of cracks spreading through the ice even as he added water to it. Jekyll snorted. Come on. You know that's not true, or that at least it never applied to us runners. He felt quiet, and Tibbs focused on adding ice between him and the fire lapping at it. Thing I don't get, he finally said, puzzled. Really, the one thing that baffles me in all this is why you even cared. My father took her. Are you fucking kidding me? Ice shattered. Water steams as Tibbs forced it in place. No, I mean, it's not like she was your girl, special or otherwise. She was just the team's sorcerer. She was good looking, I'll give you that. So I'm sure you'd enjoy that, but shut up! The ice melted as heat poured through. She was my family. I don't need to have my dick in someone to give a fuck about them. But you wanted to, right? Jekyll smirked, and Tibbs' sword and shield started smoking. Considering how often you made sure to be alone with her, learning your letters, he rolled his eyes. You kept talking about how you never wanted someone special, but you wanted her. Right? You wanted her in your bed, to feel her skin against yours, hear her moans as you pushed your cock. Fire swallowed Tibbs' scream as it exploded at the fighter. It hit the etched wall and scattered, but Tibbs kept feeding it his rage, and it rejoiced, consumed all it touched. How dare, you know what, this is another paragraph. How dare he reduce what he felt for her to nothing more than fucking? When Tibbs stopped, the haze of heat didn't immediately dissipate. When it did, Jekyll stood, panting and swearing. Oh, I am so glad that worked, the fighter said. Once. Tibbs snarled and sent fire at Jekyll again, who only then realized the previous attack had destroyed his hatching. Jekyll threw himself out of the way and tapped the ground on landing. Earth essence poured into it, and pillars of stone leaped up to intercept the fire. They didn't last long, as hungry as Tibbs' fire was, even dungeon reinforced stone was consumed. Jekyll yelled, but Tibbs didn't listen. His own scream mixed in with the fire's roar being all that mattered. The fighter moved quickly, either staying ahead of the fighter or throwing stone up to block it. As Tibbs got tired of the chase, he regained enough sense to see the solution. If Jekyll was going to spend his time running, Tibbs was going to take that away from him. He released fire in all direction with a victorious scream, fed it some more, made it more than what he'd unleashed in the Ratling's camp. Let Jekyll try to survive that. When he felt like it had been long enough, he fed the fire more. He wasn't risking Jackal being sneaky and able to take more heat than Tibs expected. He was going to melt that stone body off until all that was left was his essence. Then Tibs was going to rip that apart. The fire didn't stop willingly, but Tibs was its master. Panting, he turned in place, taking in the charred walls and the empty space. He'd won, he thought, snarly. He'd killed Jackal for tarnishing Karina's memory. He'd killed him for bad-mouthing his family. Tibbs had killed Jackal. He'd... Jackal? No. He looked around. The only sound the crackling of cooling stone. What had he done? He snarled, looking at the blackened and melted ceiling. What did you make me do? Hey, Tibbs, someone said, and he whirled in time for the fist to hit him in the face. That fucking hurt. Tibbs looked up at the smoking fighter from where he landed. His armor was charred and peeling, and the stone face didn't look right. Part of it was drooping. You're alive! Jackal stood, unable to believe he'd survived that kind of heat. No thanks to you, Jackal snarled. I swear to the abyss, Tibbs, if that ruined my pouch, I will make you pay. You made me do it, he screamed, heat flaring back. Horrified, Tibbs pushed it down, reached for water, pushed it up until it stopped steaming. He needed to. He was on his back again. His concentration shattered. Oh no, Jackal kicked him. We are so not fucking done. Tibbs suffused himself with air, and the next kick went through him. Then he had a whirlwind around the fighter as he lifted himself up, trying to do the same with him so he could smash him against the wall until there was nothing more than the rubble those creatures became when they died. He poured more and more essence into the wind. How could Jackal be so heavy? He was nothing more than stone, and the fighter's essence went deep into the stone floor. You're fucking cheating! He let go of air and reached for corruption as the fighter ran. Really? You're surprised? Jackal exclaimed, causing Stone to jump up and intercept the corruption. Is that all you have? Did Karina really mean so little to you that? Tibbs filled the room with darkness. Oh, fuck. I am going to make you pay for that. Tibbs stalked towards Jackal. She was the most important person to me. I know you longer. The fighter had his back against the wall, swinging his hands before him as if Tibbs couldn't sense and avoid the blind punches. You aren't the same. You're a brother to me. She was... He swallowed the pain. Then the punch had him on his back again. Come on, Tibbs, Jekyll mocked. At least try, okay? It's like you don't know what I can do. Earth fighter here inside an Earth dungeon? Tibbs pushed himself to a crouch. And I'm a fucking Earth rogue. He didn't bother with pillars. He sent essence into the floor, felt Stowe resist and snarled. If he hadn't wanted this to happen, he shouldn't have gotten involved. With a scream, spires of stone erupted from the floor and walls, thin and sharp, all focused on Jackal. The fighter didn't move in time. He was skewered from all sides, looking at Tibbs with a pained and fearful expression. Tibbs just snarled as the fighter tried to say something, then stilled, his head flopping down until a spire stopped it. As Tibbs watched, satisfaction growing, the stone faded from Jackal's body, his skin returning to its usual tanned hue. Tibbs stepped up to him and smirked. I win. He'd won. Abyss, he'd done it. He dropped to his knees before the corpse of his friend, the last of his family. He was alone. Utterly alone again. And he'd been the one to do it this time. He'd been happy making it happen. He wailed, wishing he could go back, swallow the words he'd said, take back the action. He should have listened to Jackal. He was smarter than he let on. If he had, Tibbs wouldn't be here. He wouldn't be so utterly alone. Arms closed around him. It's okay, Tibbs, Jackal whispered. I've got you. It's going to be okay. And that concludes chapter 35 of Breaking Step. If you are enjoying this, please leave a like. If you want to know when the next chapter will be up. Subscribe and hit the bell. If you want to read the story, it's up for free on Royal Road. If you want to read ahead of that, my Patreon is about 20 chapters ahead. And if you're looking to listen to these live, it's every Tuesday morning, 8 a.m. Eastern Time on Twitch. The links are in the notes. And with that, I shall wish you a good day.